Hi, Cory.
Hi, Ken.
Do you want to tell us briefly, first of all, about your new book, Makers?
Sure, although it's not that new a book. It's a couple of years old now. So Makers is a book about post-industrial manufacturing. It's a book that's set in an America in which the contradictions of the WTO are never really resolved. America never really seemed to have a plan for what it would do after it eliminated all of its trade barriers and allowed labor to find its lowest level in the world, and relied on essentially credit to buy goods that were getting cheaper. And so in Makers, 3D printing and small-scale entrepreneurship start to produce some pretty good returns for small groups of people. And this excites some venture capitalists who are trying to figure out what to do with their money because they've run out of businesses to invest in because they don't have them in America so much anymore. And they end up investing in this kind of seed funding on this very small scale, on a kind of Hayekian, nirvana. We have all this like little small scale stuff right at the coalface, people making decisions for themselves. And the problem is that they can't figure out how to scale it up. The market doesn't really know how to value it. All the things that they're accustomed to grow big businesses out of little businesses involve proprietary interests, which no one can figure out how to make stick anymore. No one knows how to take a 3D design and stop someone else from copying it. And the only reason they're able to start these 3D printing businesses is they're nicking someone else's designs and improving them. So it all collapses, and most of Makers is about what happens after that collapse. It's about these people going on and manufacturing in a way that kind of blends industrial manufacturing and its logic with cooperative manufacturing, with an almost artisanal or agrarian sense of agriculture, of manufacturing.
That sounds like an example of what John W. Campbell was talking about when he said that the business of science fiction is to ask the next question. You've taken the basic idea of applying a similar logic to material goods production as already exists with software production, and ask the next question: what happens after that doesn't function?
Yeah, and that's right. So it mirrors a lot of the things that are characteristic of software production, like the high degree of decoupling of workers. So in traditional artisanal production, workers are very decoupled. It's today is my day I'm working on this house, and today is a nice day. I'm going to make the door so I can work out of doors, and I'll sand the door out where the apple blossoms are scenting the air, and tomorrow I'll do something else. And you've got to make sure the door is there by the time the family's moving in, but you're not very tightly coupled the way you would be on an assembly line, where if you decide that today is not a good day to screw on your bolt, the next guy down the line is going to have some serious problems. But in software, we have a kind of third way where you're doing something that is very high productivity, right? You produce things that are very complicated that require a lot of different people's input, but you do it without even having to work alongside each other, or for one person necessarily always depending on another's labor. And so doing that with physical goods is a pretty remarkable idea. I don't think anyone really knows what it's going to look like, and I don't know that I'm really predicting anything. I think at best I'm being aspirational, or creating a parable. So I'm aspiring to a future in which we have a largely bloodless post-industrial revolution that doesn't have the blood that we associate with the Industrial Revolution, and that maybe staunches the blood that is characteristic of the Information Age. The 80 million people migrating to South China to be chained to factories for a decade of the WTO.
Speaking of which, I understand that the book came out after Makers. Wasn't that For the Win?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, that's the one about basically unionizing the online oppressed and exploited.
Well, so the idea is that again, it's a kind of parable about contemporary labor politics that's somewhat aspirational. For the last 11, 12 years, labor has been largely outfoxed by capital because capital was able to move very nimbly into new regions, but labor couldn't. So you might unionize your shop, but your shop would close and reopen somewhere else that you couldn't go because you needed a passport to get there, and the passport authorities wouldn't let you in. And this is about a near future in which there's workforces that all use the same internet, even though they're in different countries. And as a consequence, when one shop closes, those workers can go and talk with their replacements in another shop, even if it's halfway around the world. And I thought the most kind of characteristic internet world that these people could be in is online games. And online games are already the source of a lot of strange, semi-licit economic activity. There's about 400,000 people in the Pacific Rim who earn their living as gold farmers. That's people who do repetitive tasks in video games, which are against the rules of the game, to amass virtual wealth that's then sold on to rich players, mostly in the West and the North, who are too bored or lazy or time-pressed to do those repetitive tasks themselves. And so the idea is that as that becomes a larger part of the economy and becomes a legitimate part of the economy, it becomes securitized, it becomes part of the financial engineering strategy of big firms, and the workforces find themselves, on the one hand, almost totally dispensable because there's lots of people who can play video games, but on the other hand, uniquely poised to organize among themselves.
Yeah, I think gold farming, I was actually startled when you said 400,000. It's that's in the real world now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's really hard to get good estimates because most of it is illicit. But I mean, there was just a story last week that North Korea is trying to destabilize South Korean video game economies by paying people to play games and game their economies.
Wow.
Yeah, I got a lot of email from it. And whenever stuff like that happens, I get tons of email from people saying, you predicted this. And again, I'm like, I didn't predict it. There was already gold farming. It was already being discussed. I simply sort of posited. I did that Gedanken experiment thing where you kind of ignore a bunch of other variables and take one thing and make it very large and say, well, what would the world look like then? Just as a way of kind of better understanding that phenomenon, right? When you, in the same way that experimentally you try to isolate a single phenomenon out of everything else, you control all the other variables. Not because in the world, you know, you have you exist in a world in which you only have one microbe that tries to colonize you at a time, but because the best way to understand that microbe in and of itself is to have it acting alone.